If your pupil is too dilated, there's a risk that the tissue could travel under the iris rather than over the iris. So one of the things that we've talked about is to ensure that your injector tip is all the way across the iris. Finally, if you're injecting and your injector bevel is up rather than down, that can also create some difficulties, especially as you're coming out of the eye and then there's a gap there where the tissue potentially could escape. In terms of when the tissue is being injected, the graft can either be injected out of the eye, it can escape through, once it's in, it can then once again escape back out through the main incision. The graft itself can also shoot back into the injector while you're withdrawing the injector, the pressure gradient is too high from inside the eye to out. If the graft is injected behind the iris, that can also pose some difficulty. And then once again, if it's upside down. So we'll just review some of the videos here on some complications, bloopers if you will. You can see how rescue techniques are used. So here the tissue is shot out of the injector. You can just pick it up and put it back in, and once again kind of try it again if it keeps wanting to come out, and just pick it up and put it back in, and it still seems to want to misbehave there. So eventually you can see another video here where when the bevel is up, it can shoot out very easily. Here it's escaping back through the incision, partially into the injector. So once again, the nice thing about the tissue is it's actually fairly strong. You can just pick it up with the tires and plop it back into the injector and try to get it through into your main wound again. If it's on the way out halfway and you catch it in the main incision, just make sure you keep the eye very soft while you're trying to nudge it back inside the anterior chamber. Here the tissue shoots back directly into the injector because the pressure is too high in the eye. So make sure you have to have a very shallow chamber. And here the graft has gone behind the iris there. So your reflex is now blue. And you can just irrigate into the bag, so then that changes the pressure gradient. So there's high pressure gradient in the bag and lower in the anterior chamber, and that'll kind of force the graft to come back out. Here you can see the graft was being injected behind the iris. So this is what happens when you inject too quickly and the pressure is too high. You don't have as much control over the graft. And this is not using one of the glass injectors. That was using one of the modified lens injectors. So the nice thing with the glass injectors is it has a very long, narrow tip that can carry across the iris, so that your risk of injecting it behind the iris or through the pupil is much less. But you can see here that it is rescuable. Once again, it's all about flow of fluid. So if you direct the flow into the bag, it'll force the tissue to come back anteriorly. Here the tissue's upside down. You saw the lovely case edited earlier, just with multiple taps again, trying to check, and once again the F is upside down. So really it's about persistence, and don't really want to persist too much, because if you irrigate for too long you can actually lose the F marking and then you're not sure where the up or down is. These are some videos showing complications of the unfolding process. Here you can see it's a very tight scroll. If you don't have any of the special tools with the bi-directional cannula, really it's just a matter of compressing the graft where it's slightly open and then doing more tapping and keeping the anterior chamber shallow. That really is key. Once you get a portion of it unfolded, it does make it much more doable. Here the visibility is quite poor. There's a bit of scarring from chronic pseudophakic bullous keratopathy likely. Certainly removing the epithelial layer, if there is epithelial edema, makes your view much, much better. You can do that at any point in the case if you're finding it that it's difficult. In fact, sometimes even at the end of the case, if I find that there's a lot of edema and the epithelium's loose, I'll just debride it. It does help with the recovery of vision, I think, as well as takes away some of the work of the endothelium from needing to pump away all that epithelial edema. You can see here it just takes a bit of work to keep tapping away to try to get it to fully unfold. And here it's important to actually not mark your entire circumference of where you want it to strip, because then you lose the edge visibility, which is important to see the centration. So here once again is another kind of upside down graft. And luckily there is a marking there to indicate that. So just with little puffs of injection of fluid, you can get it back into the proper scroll and orientation. And if you see where the marking is, I recommend trying to unfold that half of it first, so that if you see that it's once again in the wrong direction, you can quickly abort and kind of rotate again, rather than unfolding the whole thing and then realizing you have to try to reverse the graft. Here, once again, a not great view, and the graft itself is a bit large for the size of the eye. That can sometimes pose as difficulty as well. So it's a matter of just irrigation, tapping, and maintaining the anterior chamber at not too shallow, not too deep, but shallow enough that there is some compression effect and that the graft can sort of manipulate itself on the iris side. You can see that things usually can clear up nicely. You can complete the transplant safely. So things to do to prevent, and some tips. Make sure the graft, when you insert it, if it's a single scroll, that there's that V sign that's facing upwards. You really want to make sure that you mark the graft. It's really helpful, especially with your first few cases, and even once you've done many hundreds of them, just sometimes that mark really does save you. Make sure you create a proper incision size and construct the wound in a proper bi-level technique so that it can seal very well. And this allows the injector to be fully inserted into the anterior chamber and make sure it's watertight. You always want to inject and then also pull the injector out with the bevel side down. If you're going to use an AC maintainer, make sure you turn it off during the injection step, or you can use no anterior chamber maintainer at all, and just have one of the paracenteses as your control. You can press at the lip of it to shallow the eye, and then if you want to re-inflate the eye, you can just inject fluid in directly through one of your paracenteses. In terms of sliding the injector, you want to slide it once again across the pupil to avoid injection behind the iris. It's much easier to do this if you have one of the newer devices that are designed especially for DMEK, rather than creating a modified injector using a IOL cartridge. You want to reduce the anterior chamber pressure before you pull the injector out, and you want to apply very gentle pressure on the incision upper lip to make sure that it remains closed as you exit. You can either use a cannula for that, a Wexel, or, and then that way it can ensure just that bit of pressure. And you want to make sure that the pupil is constricted prior to injection. We use Myocol, and then that. And you can also stroke the iris a bit to encourage the iris to really shrink down before you do your injection part. These are after phaco cases, and another tip with phaco is not to actually use any dilation drops in advance. Just do your procedure with the slight dilation that occurs with the subtenon's injection. Also, you want to make sure that the BSS bag that's flowing has no epinephrine in it. Otherwise, that can add to the dilation of the pupil, which you do not want. Finally, you can also use an intraocular non-serrated forceps, for example, the MST 25 gauge grasper, to pull the tissue into position if it's half unfolded and for whatever reason the second half doesn't seem to want to unfold, or you had difficulty unfolding it, and so you don't want to lose that orientation of the tissue. The tissue is amazingly strong once it's actually prepared and in the eye, and so I've just grabbed it and pulled it into centration position, and it seems to work well. And make sure it's a 25 gauge, because the MST forceps graspers also come in a 20 gauge, and the 20 gauge is too large and you'll have a leaky wound. So the 25 is really nice because it'll fit through your paracentesis really well, and you can just grab it and pull it right into place. I think I used it for the first time when I got really frustrated with tapping for what felt like 30 minutes, and I was like, just give me something to grab it with, and I'm going to get this thing into position and just get the air in, and let's be done with it. So sometimes in times of frustration, you find creative ways to do things. So thank you very much.